in drums.
Love that music. Love that music. Anyway, we're back. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Scott.
This is it's a little show that we have called Solid Ground, where we talk about just about anything under the sun. And my understanding is that Mike and I have a lot of great conversations, and some of those conversations challenge me because I come in with opinions, and Mike's got very informed opinions. Mine are probably more misinformed, but and so we just kind of really push each other and prod each other to get to the heart of a subject. And there are a billion subjects out there that should really be talked about in a kind of a civil and just in a way where we try to get to the truth. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's good. And, we've always thought we should record these conversations because they're kind of fun conversations that we've had for many years.
Most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time.
No, they're always good. They're always good. Always fruitful for me. Always fruitful for me. So we thought maybe there might be people who are listening in to this private conversation of ours, and they don't know who we are or what we're bringing to the table or why they should even care about what we say. They're looking at a guy with white glasses, and already they're like, I'm a little skeptical of this. So for those who might not know, I'm Scott, and just in a 1 minute kind of snippet about who I am and where I'm coming from, I'm a father of 8 children and a little bit insane, but I come from a family, I'm third of 11 children. And I will say one of the biggest things about my past is that my family's unofficial motto growing up was you only take seriously what needs to be taken seriously. So there were a few things in my life where, okay, you don't joke about that, or you don't push that too much. But my gosh, almost everything else was up for teasing and joking. And so I really learned from an early age not to take myself so seriously. And I tried to bring my kids up with that kind of a philosophy too. The other thing is I'm an architect by degree, but God called me in a strange, adventurous way into youth ministry about 10 years ago. So I flip-flop between those two things pretty often. And I think the thing I love about it is I like figuring out people and why people think the way they think, and then trying to put all of those pieces together in a very cohesive way that makes sense. Finally, I'm the kind of person, I ask a ton of questions. I don't have all these degrees, and I'm a very slow reader. So I rely a lot on forming my opinions around common sense and trying to ask a lot of questions to get to the truth of it. I'm not a big jump on the bandwagon person. So it takes me a while to make a stand on a certain issue. But that is me in a nutshell.
Okay.
Tell me about you, Mike. Who are you, and why are you here?
So I guess I'm married with 4 children. I'm going through a lot of adolescence and teenagers right now who are trying to be grown-up adults, which is, it's good. It's good. They're showing signs of maturity, and that's always very gratifying as a parent. And I would say our family takes things way too seriously. I need to laugh at that because it's so true. It's always a challenge to get the Therriens to laugh at themselves. So anyhow, but that's okay. We're a very contemplative bunch. We think very deeply, very intellectual type of family, I would say. I think that's true. And part of that is yours truly has multiple degrees in theology. My terminal degree was a doctorate in moral theology. So we tend to talk, you and I, a lot about moral questions, don't we? And what's going on in the world. We'll be doing that today, in fact. But I just have a passion for not only understanding our faith, but I really love trying to communicate it and trying to help people understand it, especially in times like these. Not just with coronavirus, but I mean, just in general, we live in an age in which, people have kind of, drifted away from the practice of their faith and their religion. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people just don't understand what we believe. And so I always welcome the opportunity to be able to share the faith with other people. And, you and I, like we've said, we've had so many great conversations over the years, and you do ask a lot of really great questions for a guy like me. I like that because I like to at least think I have good answers to those questions. But you have some zingers. Sometimes I don't have good answers to your questions. They're tough. But anyhow, we've been in the trenches together many years, kind of doing ministry, not necessarily in the same ministries, but we've both been doing ministry and been friends at the same time. And so I think for me, this is a little bit of a dream come true, having an opportunity to sit with you and have these conversations and share them with other people. So I'm super excited about that.
Me too. We get to talk. Yeah. That's like, what's better than that, man?
We have so many kids. We can never get together otherwise.
That's
right?
True. And the only thing that would be better than kind of talking is like sitting around a campfire with some beers and or like a good scotch and things like that. But I should have like a scotch with me for every show, just to, because that's also a part of who I am. I'm German. What can you say?
So am I. But
that is
French
true.
name.
That is true. Well, okay. So this is probably more of a topic that's driven by me. I'm always fascinated by kind of the conversations that don't happen, right? And the reasons why they don't happen. And I guess sometimes I think, let's just get to the heart of it, judgment. I think sometimes as Christians, we are, or just people who want to be good people, are afraid sometimes to be honest or to express or talk about opinions that they may have or convictions that they may have about any topic that is sensitive, because they don't want to be labeled judgy, or they don't want to be labeled bigoted or insensitive, right? And on some level, again, I probably couldn't very intellectually put this into words, but on some level, I'm bothered by that, because I do think that there is room for us to be judgmental in some ways. But I think part of that is that the word judgment and judgy is a little bit taken out of what it really means. So I don't know if you want to just kind of open that up first. Like what do we mean by judgment? When somebody calls us judgy, what do you think they mean? And what does that really mean?
Yeah, well, I would say I want to talk first about the experience that people have, and then maybe make a couple of comments about what the church teaches about judgment. So I think the experience is that people do feel condemned by people in our world today. People, we're a very polarized, and there's a lot of tension. And we also, sometimes we try to button things up in a certain way and stick people in different categories. We're very good with labels. We're very good with, which has a counter reaction in like brand identity. You know, people have certain brand identities, because I think where that comes from is that people feel labeled. And today people are adopting those labels as their identity. This is who I am. You know, so, whatever. You can think of a million examples of this, whether it's a person's sexual orientation, or it's a person's fashion preferences, or a person's into sports or whatever, but we just love labels. Yeah, exactly. So we have a lot of labeling that goes on, and labels make us feel diminished or reduced in some way. So, like, in other words, when you get caricatured, you get reduced to one aspect without any reverence or regard for the whole person that's in front of you. And we naturally, as human beings, we resist that, because we know that our lives are much more, much more complex in that there's much more to us than just labels and reductions like that. So I think that one thing that people are like trying to get at when this term judgy is that sometimes people feel like they're just being condemned or held in contempt in another person's heart because they've been reduced or labeled in some way and therefore dismissed as, someone that's not important.
Okay. And yeah, that's super, super well stated. But that makes me think of other questions. And I'm going to just jump into a very personal example, right? And I think it's one thing for people to feel sensitive if somebody is like labeling them, maybe specifically in a way that they don't want to be labeled. But I also do feel like there's a lot of self-labeling that happens. And if you are a person who might disagree with that self-labeling, right, then that's where the conflict happens. So let me use an example, and you can tell me your thoughts on this, and if it's possible. So I have a friend that at some point in their life came out of the closet and identified as being a gay man, and I, at the time I was very loving and very supportive of our friendship, regardless of any disagreement I may have had with that particular part of who he is, and so as time went on, there became a lot of pressure for me to wholeheartedly and just 100% adopt and celebrate and be perfectly okay with that part, right? And whenever I try to propose the idea that I can love him, that I can be his friend, that our friendship and our relationship can be absolutely, the same, but that I don't necessarily have to celebrate that thing, or I don't have to, promote it or celebrate it. It became an all or nothing proposal for him. It was either you 100% love everything about me, everything, or we cannot have a friendship. And I was a little hurt by that because I believe that, we do this all the time. We have friendships with people all the time where we don't necessarily love everything that they do or everything about them, but we're still friends with them. So I guess the question I'm getting at is, I'm making a judgment about one aspect of this person's life. Obviously, for me, I see it as that's just one part of them, right? It's not the defining thing. And this person obviously sees that thing as the defining thing. And because we had disagreements about that, he can't accept my love as a friend. And I don't know, I'm still like, that still just bugs the crap out of me. And I want to punch him. Like I want to physically get into an altercation because it's still,
Really?
I don't understand it.
Yeah.
So
you don't really want to punch him.
Yeah, no, probably not. Probably not. Maybe slap.
Well, yeah, it is aggravating because there's a lot of moral signaling going on there, or virtue signaling going on there. So in other words,
what do you mean by that?
Well, you're not a virtuous person if you don't accept the good on my terms, and therefore, there's an implied judgment of you that you're judgmental and that you don't really love me and really accept me. And that's unfortunate because, regardless of the issue, that's just not a fair way to frame it for anybody. Again, there's kind of an inverted problem going on there because he's wearing a brand identity or a label and reducing himself to that label and then expecting everybody to relate to him and love him on those terms, which is really not realistic. It's like, and again, but what I want to point out is that I think the reason why people do that kind of even on that subconscious level is that I think our culture has not, like, for example, just take the issue of sexual orientation. We haven't necessarily dealt with people who have that struggle in a way that was very understanding and very compassionate. And I want to address that more in a minute, but I think that we have to acknowledge that fact. So in other words, if you feel like you've been rejected again and again and again and again, let me give you an example, okay, from my own life, which is not morally shot through with sort of significance, but it's kind of a parallel example. So growing up, for me, I was really small. and everybody made small jokes and everybody made fun of me. And, so, I got tired of that. And so, you come to a point where you say, well, being small is who I am. I'm going to assert myself. I'm a small statured guy. I have a small frame. What are you going to do about it? It's who I am, right? But it's like, yeah, not really. I mean, I'm not reducible to the size of my body. That's not what's most significant or essential to me. And I'm the one growing up who had a problem with it. And I had to come to terms with the fact that the size I am, my height and my weight and my body frame, that's part of my reality, and I have to live with that. So by way of a kind of a parallel, I think that we have to, as a people, learn how to accept people as people first. That's the first response and we have to learn to accept ourselves as a person before we identify with anything that's truly accidental. It's not essential. We're not more or less human on account of our sexual orientation or on account of our height or weight. We're a human person because we're made in the image and likeness of God. We have a body, we have a soul. We're capable of love, we're capable of thought and knowledge and freedom and things like that. That's what makes us essentially what we are. The rest of it is sort of like these accidental things that, I have brown hair and pale skin, you're wearing white glasses. None of these things are things that are ultimately like essential to the dignity that we have. And so that's got to be our starting place for everybody, whether it's you or your friend or, whatever.
That's a hard.
And that's the problem is we don't do that. We label people. We do reduce them. We minimize them, and to something, and that's particularly problematic when we reduce a person on the basis of some sin or fault that they have.
Right. Even that statement, of course, is so, you're like treading on really thin ice there with people because, and just using sexual orientation as an example, somebody, even using the word like a sin or a fault of theirs and like focusing on that one thing, they would absolutely bristle at that because, they don't, there's no sin or no fault in that for them. It's the way that God created them. And because of such, that is a major, major part of their identity. But I lost my train of thought. So.
Well, let me just pick up on that. It's true that is how they respond. They don't see a moral issue there. Right? They think it is just who they are, and God made them that way. Okay, and that's the disputed issue, right? That we have as Christian people, because we would say no, that God did not create you that way, and it's not who you are. Okay, it's a set of desires and inclinations that have emerged in you as a person, which are not a whole lot different than other desires and attractions that people can have. Okay, and so the question is, there's another issue, which I think maybe now is a good time to bring it up, is that, as people of faith, we do believe that we are obligated, not permitted, obligated to make moral judgments about what's good and evil. But the object of a moral judgment is always an action, what people do. And we have to decide whether an action is good or evil, whether that action pertains to ourselves, whether that action pertains to other people. Right now, for example, we have this case of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. People are making judgments about the actions of those two men that killed him. They're making moral judgments. They're condemning that action. They're probably doing even more than that. Okay? Is it legitimate to make a moral judgment about an action which is morally reprehensible? Of course it is. We do it all the time. But unfortunately, we have people who say, well, when it comes to sexual behavior, that's not subject, certain kinds of sexual behavior are not subject to moral judgments. Or the moral judgment that they're making is, well, these sexual acts are okay. So again, let's be clear, from the church's perspective, a person who has an orientation that's homosexual orientation, that's not a sin. It's not a sin to have that orientation because the orientation is not an action. It's an inclination of a person, which the science on where that inclination originates is not clearly known. Some people say it's genetic, some people think it's environmental, some people think it's psychological. Let's not get into that because there's no consensus within the scientific community about it. People have their own opinions about it. But what we know is that as Christians, we say, but the behavior that might follow from that inclination, the lifestyle, the actions that would proceed, that's what we make a moral judgment about. And it's no different than saying, is it wrong of me to have an inclination towards, like, in other words, if I find my neighbor's wife attractive, am I committing a sin? Well, no.
I know your neighbor, and I know you don't.
Okay, but but I mean, I haven't acted or behaved yet. Now, if I act upon that, then I would be committing a sin, right? And if I went all the way in that would be the sin of adultery. And we make a moral judgment about that because the object of a judgment, a moral judgment, is an action. It's what people decide and do. And so one of the things that I think creates a lot of confusion is sometimes we condemn people for things that are not a matter of their own choice, like their race. Racism is horrible because you don't make moral judgments about people on the basis of their race.
Right.
Or even their culture,
right,
to a certain extent. You make moral judgments about what people do. And so the question around, sexual orientation or whatever is the question of, well, as Christians, do we believe that it is morally upright in accordance with God's will that a person act in a homosexual way? And people who want to act in that way are going to be angry, just as we would be if I wanted to do any other sin. Like, let's say I'm stuck in a substance abuse cycle, and someone calls me out on it and says, "Hey, I think you might have an alcohol problem." Of course, I'm going to be angry with that person because they're going to be getting near to something that's dear to me, and I want to justify myself, and I want to feel like it's okay.
Right.
So anyway, I've gone on too long. Go on.
No, here's an example. No, it's great. Here's an example that I often use. I've had friends in the past that they're from an area and a culture and a family where the F-bomb is like an article of speech, like "an" and "the," like that's how often they would use it. And me personally, I was able to look past that and just see who the person was inside and appreciate them and build a friendship on that. But whenever they would come over to my house, and I had a child at the time, I would stop them and say, "Listen, leave that at the door. We're trying to raise our kid this way, to kind of respect the language she uses and stuff like that. So if you don't mind, please don't use that." And it would have been absolutely absurd for that person to be like, "That's just a part of who I am. I just, and it was okay. They understood. Yeah. Okay. You don't love every single part of me. But because because I have other things at play, how I'm going to raise my kids, the exposure to things, I kind of have, like you said, an obligation to make judgments, to make moral judgments in terms of what that interaction, who they're interacting with, especially what goes on in my home, it's just that's a hard thing for somebody. It's a hard thing for somebody to be told, there's a part of you that I want you to leave at the door, especially whenever they make that thing the most important thing. And I think we just live in a culture where we can make any part of us the thing that defines us. And it's so arbitrary that it's hard to even have a civil conversation about it, because it's just an opinion. Like, it's just somebody's willy-nilly desire to define themselves as that thing. How do you even debate that? How do you talk about that?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is, I always say this, but that's coming from a wounded place, a place of pain. When people get defensive and they feel the need to justify themselves, that means that they're unresolved about it in themselves. Because I would say, if they were really at peace with all of that, right, they wouldn't make an issue of it. They would be respectful to you, and they would yield to you because they would want to honor you and your values just as much as they want their values honored. But the bottom line is they're not resolved in themselves about it. They're in conflict, and so they project that conflict onto you because you represent their conscience to them, and they don't like it. And it's their own conscience they're having a hard time with. So that's a bit of moral psychology that we have to understand. But you know how I know this, Scott? I know this because I never do that, and everyone else around me does. I never project my own conflict onto other people. I just rise above that. I'm kind of a very holy and saintly man. So I just
you almost snuck that by me. You almost snuck that.
No, I know that because that's what I do every single day of my life. And if we're honest with ourselves, every one of us does that every day of our life. We all have ways in which we project our own inner conflicts onto other people, and we fight against the voice of conscience within our own soul by taking issue with other people who we accuse of judging us, when really the reality is we're judging ourselves. If we were truly at peace with those things, we would be at peace with our neighbor who thinks differently than us. But there would be an openness to the truth, a certain kind of humility, and a willingness even to consider another person's point of view and even change.
I think that if we stopped the show right there and just everybody just pondered that last piece, that is huge, man. That's a really awesome statement. So push pause on your computers and discuss amongst yourselves. Really, that's beautiful. I wanna kind of switch gears just a little bit. And a lot of times whenever I'm reading an article that has to do with something controversial, and I know like a big thing of controversy right now in Pennsylvania is that our Secretary of Health is a transgender, and I'm going to screw it up. It's a man that transitioned to a woman, right? And that's not something that's universally acceptable to people. It's just not. Like some people have a really hard time kind of coming to terms with what that means. And so a lot of the comments after the articles that I read, like there's a lot of scripture that's being thrown around. And I want to throw out some scripture to you, Mike, and I want you to maybe clarify maybe the misconceptions that someone may have or how it can be misused. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, here we go. Get ready.
Okay, I'm on the stand.
Yes, this is from Stump the Theologian. So this is from the Gospel of Matthew. It's probably the most popular one. Do not judge others, so that God will not judge you. No, hold on. Let me keep going. This is from John, chapter 3. For God did not send his Son into the world to be its judge, but to be its Savior. Okay, now here's another one. And this is after that. This is interesting because it seemingly conflicts that. And this is from John chapter 5. Nor does the Father himself judge anyone. He has given his Son the full right to judge. Even though just before that it said that Jesus didn't come into the world to judge, but to be its Savior. Okay, now, this is from Paul's letter to Corinthians. After all, it is none of my business to judge outsiders. God will judge them. But should you not judge the members of your own fellowship? As the scripture says, remove the evil person from your group. So those are just a few examples of, like, the word judge shows up a lot in scripture, and Christians and non-Christians throw it around like crazy. Please provide some clarification for us.
Yeah. Don't put me on the spot, Okay,
Okay,
I'm gonna go deep here.
go ahead.
Quick.
Go deep. Go deep.
Okay. First of all, I think that we have to distinguish between making a moral judgment, that is the right function of our conscience. Of course, we're supposed to make moral judgments.
Give
How
some
would,
examples.
well, the fact that Jesus gives us commandments means that we have to make moral judgments because a command is a moral judgment. It's a conclusion of a moral argument. Thou shalt not is not the beginning of an argument, it's the end of an argument. So that we have to make moral judgments to survive in this world, and we do it all the time, and we should get over this idea of moral relativism. It's ridiculous. It is moral relativism is a misnomer. Okay, moral relativists are not moral relativists; they're moral opportunists.
Explain
That's
that.
it means that people will relativize certain values in favor of the values that they hold dear. So they're actually making a moral judgment by making a judgment of moral relativism. And it's silly. So yeah, people need to stop doing that. It's call it out when people say, well, you have your truth and I have my truth. It's like, actually, that's just totally false. That's not true. You don't think that way, because as soon as I say you're wrong, you're going to get mad at me. And the reason why you're mad at me is because you're making a moral judgment that I'm wrong. So let's just get over the play. The question at hand is, how do we decide what is good and what is evil? We all believe that there is good and evil, but we don't agree on the criteria by which we judge what's good and what's evil. So we're all permitted to make moral judgments, and we have to work through those disagreements as a civil society, because we don't all come out of the same worldview. And that's okay. That's where we are in the human race right now, and that's okay. But we have to have civil discourse around how do we determine what's good and what's evil, and let's have dialogue around it and see if we can come to consensus so we can get along better. Okay, that's the first thing. And there are going to be areas where, like for example, in religion, where we agreed as a country long ago that we're not all going to agree on being of the same faith, but we're going to allow people of different faiths to worship in this country. And we're going to give that freedom because we realize that we can't solve the problem of religious pluralism on a human or historical level. Only God will be able to resolve that at the end. Okay, so that leads me into the second point, which is that God says, don't judge in a manner that you think you're going to resolve all differences. Because what can happen when we make moral judgments is we also think we're judge and executioner. So in other words, because I judge that what you're doing is wrong, I'm also going to correct your problem for you. And I might even use the government or the state to do that. And that's where the Lord says, you can't resolve every evil problem in the world. You would destroy the world in the attempt to do that. So it's not our place to root out. This is why Jesus says, let the wheat and the weeds grow together. And at the end of the ages, the harvest will come and I will separate them. That's also an implied challenge. And that implied challenge is that I got to learn to love and learn to live with the wheat, even though I have a profound disagreement. So where the line is that I might disagree with a person morally, but I can never, and this is the way I put it, but I can never hold that person in contempt in my heart. I can never condemn them. And so when Jesus says, don't judge, because you will be judged against the measure with which you judge, what Jesus is referring to is not, you're not allowed to make a moral judgment. What he's saying is, you are never, ever, ever, ever permitted to look down upon another person because of their sin or their faults, because you are that person. Okay. You have to love the other as another self, and you love the other as another self with mercy and understanding, and you sympathize and empathize with their weakness. And that's when let me just finish. I'm sorry, I'm going on, but that's when Jesus says, I was not sent in the world to judge. What he's saying is, I was not sent into the world this time to condemn the world, but to save it. When I come again at the end of time, I will come to condemn the world.
Fire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And separate the wheat from the chaff, the goats from the sheep, etc.
Okay. So I want to let's kind of like we used this example before, and I don't mean to harp on like sexual orientation is an easy one because it's a very out front kind of issue that the Christians and secular society is kind of battling with, trying to figure out how to live peacefully and come to common agreements and stuff. But okay, so we're permitted to make moral judgments, right? Is what you said. So and we used this example a while back, but I want to use the example again of the baker, right? I'm a baker and I have a passion for it, and I use that to kind of, help people celebrate different events like birthdays and parties and weddings and blah blah blah. So somebody comes in, a homosexual comes in, they want me to bake a cake for their wedding. And as a baker, and let's say I'm a devout Christian baker, and I have some serious moral hesitations about promoting or celebrating that kind of a thing. And I say, I just can't. I can't do that for you. Legally, I'm kind of forced to do that, right? Like, so what do we do in that area where we can, like, we're supposed to make moral judgments, but in some cases, we can't really exercise the right to do so?
Yeah, and I think what's really unique about those situations where they've come up is that people in our culture are drawing a moral equivalency between sexual behavior and race. Okay, so this is the logic. So you got to understand the logic, and if you understand it from within their perspective, it actually makes sense. It's just mistaken and wrong.
Okay, so yeah, lay it out.
So if I say, people will say, well, on the basis of your decision to not bake the cake for this gay couple, how are you any different than the white person who demanded that the black person have to drink at this water fountain?
Sure.
Or sit at the back of the bus? Clearly, we all agree that that's an egregious offense against the dignity of those people. Okay, well, why is that? Well, because again, back to what I said earlier, we are discriminating against a person on the basis of something which is, first of all, not a matter of their own choice or behavior. You only make moral judgments about actions, never about what is intrinsic to an individual.
It's a good point.
So you're comparing apples to oranges. So to condemn a person and put them to death or persecute them or treat them terribly because of their race is a horrible thing. Now, when it comes to homosexual behavior, let me throw in a couple of other things for us as Catholic Christians we find problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about contraception. Let's talk about pornography. Let's talk about adultery, masturbation. These are all sexual acts that we take a moral exception to. And the reason why is not because we're taking issue with people's feelings, sexual feelings, but because we're taking an exception, because we all have disordered sexual feelings. Let's just all admit it. We all have, it's called concupiscence. It's part of the fallen legacy of human nature. Well, it's, concupiscence, but we all have that. But we're all called to live a virtuous life and conduct our behavior in a way that's morally upright. And so when a gay couple comes to a baker, what they're asking the baker to validate is their behavior, not their orientation. Their behavior, their choice to get married and perform sexual acts together in a way that radically opposes a Christian view of marriage, gender, sexual orientation, etc., whatever the case might be. So it's a very different thing. It's not apples to apples, it's apples to oranges, but that moral equivalency is often made, and that's why people don't understand. They think we're crazy, we're a bunch of bigots and haters, because they haven't thought through the difference. So on the one hand, we have to be somewhat understanding and empathetic of the person who sees it that way, because they haven't thought it through carefully enough, and we have to hopefully help them see the difference between discriminating against a person on the basis of their race versus discriminating on the basis of a chosen behavior that we believe is morally contrary to the natural law and to God's design for the human person.
Yeah. Very well stated, of course, as always. Okay, so I just want to throw out one more thing that, and I talked a little bit about this earlier. But so Dr. Levine in Pennsylvania has become quite the little controversial creature, because it's you know, she is a very very much a public figure, and so there's a lot of the discussion around it. You know, you get the people on the far ends of the extreme that are like just being very rude and insensitive, you know, and not even in a charitable like way, but just very much denigrating the good doctor. And then you have, of course, the people on the other end of the extreme that are just like, this is the greatest thing. It has no, you know, who cares what credentials they have. It's just such a champion, a championship victory for the LGBTQ, whatever other letters, community. So, my thing, like, I'm trying to, as a person who lives in Pennsylvania and is under the advice of the doctor, I'm always like, okay, there's a moral sort of strangeness that's going on there. You know, like the Catholic Christian in me just wants to be like, okay, oh my gosh, I don't like the concept of transgenderism is so foreign to me, and I can't even understand the psychology behind that. And the fact that this person is the state's highest doctor, and they teach in the Department of Pediatrics and psychiatry. There's so many things that are strange about that. Now, could the person obviously be transgender and absolutely the most qualified individual to be in that position? Yes, they could be. I guess what I'm not sure what I'm asking. Like, I guess it's like, is there a moral judgment to be made about that, the person being in a high profile position like that with their background, being transgendered, or do I just need to be like, it's okay. And I should not have any issues with that. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, what's popping into my head is that we have to kind of make a distinction between what's essential and what's accidental here. Again, so what's essential to a role that a person occupies is that it's their personal competency to fulfill the responsibilities and obligations of that role. Sure. So I think what you're raising is that's not necessarily the question. That is like, we're not saying that this person is not qualified and competent to do this job,
right? They're
on
not
account of the fact that she is transgendered.
Right. Exactly.
But exactly. That's not the issue. The issue for us is that a person would be stuck into a position or a role in order to make a political point precisely on account of the fact that they are transgendered.
Right.
That's irrelevant to the person's, and that's what I'm bristling against, because it's like, why is that relevant? That's accidental to the function and role. If you're trying to make a point that this person is just as capable of doing the job, right? It's like, I don't get the point. That's sure. Not the issue. We're not, like, we want a competent person in the role, but clearly, because you're celebrating this, clearly because you're championing this, you're making the accidental thing the essential thing. And so the competency for the person becomes secondary to the agenda which is being pushed of having a person like this in the role. And so as a Christian, I stop and I think the agenda is just not getting acceptance of transgendered people in different roles. Because I would stand up and say, look, I'm not going to make, if a person can perform a role, I would be discriminating against that person if I thought that their sexual orientation or their gender identity was in any way an infringement. Now, it might depend upon the role, maybe, I don't know, but by and large, that's never going to be the case. It would be the same thing as saying, well, I don't think you can perform this job the same as a white person because you're black. Like, what? Like, that's ridiculous. That's irrational. Right. So, but when we say the reason why we're going to put this person into this role is because we want to make a statement to prove that people who are transgendered can do this job. It's like, but nobody's arguing that. What we're arguing about, what we're having an issue with, is the fact that we think that you're trying to make the transgendered choice and lifestyle legitimized and accepted. And so it has nothing to do with the role they're occupying. You're trying to make a political statement. You're trying to make a political move and use political mechanisms to force people's conscience to accept something that they don't accept. So what you're doing is you're indoctrinating. You're not giving people the freedom of thought and conscience. And then you're going to turn around and accuse us of being haters and bigots, when it's like, the reality is that you're pushing an agenda and you're actually not respecting freedom. You are in effect doing the very same thing that you're accusing us of doing.
Yeah. And while they won't explicitly, say that that's what they're doing, I mean, it does cause people to wonder if that was one of the intentions of putting Dr. Levine in that position. So we probably have to wrap this up shortly, but I wanted to throw out one more thing, and this has to do, I think, with I don't know if it's necessarily moral judgment, and maybe you can clarify whether it is or not, but there's already issues, and I've run into this with my kids had a teacher at their school that transitioned into the other gender. I know I just ruffled feathers there because there's probably like 100 genders, but they went from a man to a woman. And there's the expectation then that you have to address that person according to what gender they identify with. So in a recent interview, Dr. Levine was kind of a little put off because the reporter or the journalist kept referring to her as him, I think. And she was like, "Do not misgender me." And it's like, so what do we do? What's our response as Christians? Is that important? Is it important, first of all? And what's should we just go along with it? Do we take a stand? Do we refuse to, how do we dig in, or do we dig in, or what do we do?
Yeah, well, it's hard, but let me say this. Why don't we ask the women who are losing their athletic competitions to transgendered athletes and start the conversation there? There's clearly a disadvantage. And the irony of it is you have women that are claiming very, very explicitly that they're different than men, and they're okay with it. They want to win in an all-female competition because that's what's fair and just, and we know that. And it's okay to admit that men are physically, generally speaking, stronger than women, and women, in certain respects, and women have their strength and their power too. That's not what men have.
Right.
Okay. So when it comes to the gender thing, what you're dealing there with is underlying theory that, gender is a social construction. And so I can declare and name myself to be whatever gender. And it's a patent denial of nature. And that I have to live according to a nature which is given to me instead of a nature I choose for myself. And it's sad because here's the reality again. I want to come at this from an experiential standpoint. I have no doubt that people who see themselves as transgendered grow up or have a good amount of their life feeling and experiencing themselves in this way. I'm not going to deny that. I'm not going to, but it doesn't at the same time mean that gender, you are either a male or a female. What you have is a psychological problem, not a biological one. And the psychological problem is that there's a breakdown in your psychosexual identity, which is a wound, which shouldn't be judged morally. Okay? And that's what we've done. We've made moral judgments about those things. And the bottom line is your psychosexual identity is formed long before you're making moral choices that are acting out of those identities, that sense of self-awareness or self-consciousness. That self-consciousness comes in your teen years. When it becomes really intentional.
Right.
we don't understand. It's a mystery why people have those kinds of experiences. It could, again, it could be environmental. It could be weird family relationships. Who knows? It could be abuse. It could be all sorts of things. So in a sense, we have to, on the one hand, respond with compassion and empathy and understanding that a person who's going through that experience is going through an experience that's real for them. It involves a great deal of suffering, and they have a desire for affirmation and acceptance. And we have to, as Christians, approach it from that perspective. We cannot go to the place of judgment first, because that's the wrong response. Jesus would not respond that way.
Right.
But at the same time, we also don't need to acquiesce to a denial of the fact of nature, which is a boy is a boy and a girl is a girl. And so I think we have to, at the same time, insist on using words to name reality, because that's the function of language. Language means reality. It means real things. Words mean real things. And we can't get into the game of changing words meaning around, the meaning of words around, to mean whatever we want them to mean, because that's what the Nazis did. That's what the Soviet goulash did. That's the same rationale and logic. I can make language mean what I want, and therefore I can justify my actions. We can't go there.
Yeah. So
that's a hard fight. That means we're going to get some pies in the face. We're going to be hated on and spat on and everything for that. But the bottom line is back to the point I made earlier. If a person is enraged over you over that, that's a projection of their own inner conflict. And all we can do as Christian people is patiently, gently love into that place for them and hope that God's mercy can touch that soul and let them know, just like your friend, the fact that you continue to be in his life, it doesn't really matter how angry he is at you for not accepting him on his terms. The fact that you still want to be a friend to him in his life is a testimony to the fact that you really love him and not some construct of himself that he wants you to accept.
Yeah. So kind of like sum all of this up, right? If I were to do that, it seems like what we're talking about is that the approach of a Christian, and I think the approach of anybody who wants to be a decent human being, is that number one, we approach somebody with love first, like that we just affirm the dignity of a person, regardless of what they may be doing, where they may be at in their life. Because we believe they're created by God, and we believe that there's a worth that they have that goes beyond what their actions or whatever it might be. So,
and it's what Jesus did.
Right. So that's number one, what we have to do. And there's a lot out there of people who are not doing that. They're immediately just making people feel awful. They're bullying people via social media and comments and
mocking them. Yeah.
Yes, whatever it may be. So number one, there's that. And then number two, as Christians, we should not feel guilty, or we should not shy away from our obligation to then, to kind of parallel with that. We have to love people, but we also have to be, I guess, prudent and in our judgment of people's actions. And there is, make moral judgments about that in regard to our own selves, about, our families, all these different things that come into play with that. So the actions of people around us are constantly forcing us to make these moral judgments, whether we know it or not. But we also shouldn't necessarily feel guilty about that, because I think there's a lot of pressure to if you disagree with that, you're a jerk and you just hate people and you're a bigot. And then I think the third thing which is a really good point is that that's the Christian side. But the only way that this is ever going to work is that if the other side gives a little bit too. If they're not so in the trenches with their own thinking about their identities, their actions, their moral relativistic kind of stuff. Like, that's my truth and you cannot disagree with it, or I hate you. So I think it has to, those three things I think are pretty big points that I came away with.
Yeah, no, that's a good summary. Very good. Yeah, I think that the other side has to practice the very principles that they're demanding of us. And a couple of things I would just close with is we all want people to treat us with mercy, but we are often very judgmental of other people. And that's a profound hypocrisy at the center of the human heart. And we have to, as Christian people, we have to root that hypocrisy out of ourselves. We want to treat people with mercy so that God will treat us with mercy. That's what Jesus says. And we'll never win the moral battle against the culture until we learn to love as Christ loved, period. It's the end of the story. If we lead with legislation and judgment, we're going to lose every time because we're just going to be the Pharisees. And Jesus did not like the Pharisees. He didn't like their attitude and their approach to things. He loved them as people, of course, but he didn't like their mindset.
Right.
Okay. The second thing is that we also, while we make moral judgments, when we make moral judgments, we also can never judge people's intentions or culpability. That's the other part that I didn't mention, but I think I have to mention it before I close.
Clarify that real quick.
So, people, we often impute intention. So people do the wrong thing and then we think they did it for the wrong reason, like they did evil for evil's sake and they had bad intentions. And a lot of people do the wrong thing kind of innocently, or they don't realize what they're doing, or they have a different kind of intention. And so it's never good to impute a bad intention to a person unless they admit it, that they have a bad intention. I meant to be mean and I wanted to be mean, but so we don't want to judge people's intentions and we don't want to judge people's culpability. In other words, only God is going to determine whether the person is deserving of a punishment. So when we go to that place in our mind and our heart with another person, even if a person is doing an egregious action, we have to check ourselves. And that's, Jesus is saying, no, you can judge the action to be contrary to my will, but you have to love the person who's doing it. And we do that by giving them the benefit of the doubt, by assuming they don't know what they're doing. And Jesus models this for us on the cross, because what are one of his final words? When he's on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. That's the final word on sin and forgiveness.
Yeah.
And that needs to be ours too.
Dang. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I got nothing else beyond that. That was a perfect
All
end.
right. That's good. All right. Well, till next week.
Yay, let the comments roll in. I can't wait. It's a very touchy topic, but it's necessary, I think. And I think we handled it well. I do. So
yeah.
But if you disagree, let us know. So all right, man. Great
talking. All right,
with
take
you.
care. We'll see you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Everyone's still there?